Hi, everyone, and welcome to the next installment of our mini series on professional philosophy and its myths. Today, we're going to be talking about philosophy and neoliberalism. Now, the term neoliberalism gets tossed around quite a bit in a lot of different contexts, but when applied specifically to higher education, it refers largely to the way in which market imperatives and the logic of corporatism have come to shape the values, the structure, and the imperatives of the modern university. And to help us make sense of exactly how neoliberalism has molded higher education, and more specifically, academic philosophy, we have with us Dr. Brandon Absher, who is an associate professor of philosophy at Deauville University and a co-chair of the Radical Philosophical Association. He is the author of the book, The Rise of Neoliberal Philosophy, Human Capital, Profitable Knowledge, and the Love of Wisdom, which was published by Lexington Press a few years ago in 2021.
Yeah, we're very excited to have Brendan Absher here to talk to us about neoliberalism because one of the things that we point out in our book is that philosophers, on the whole, tend to think of what it means to do philosophy or be a philosopher in terms of big questions, big ideas, perennial concerns about truth, goodness, justice. Something that can transcend its particular historical instantiation, or if it's treated historically, the ways affected by the historical context is often treated as somewhat inessential to what philosophy fundamentally is. And our book takes a position counter to this one, where we examine philosophy in its institutional and material reality. And Dr. Absher, or Brandon's book, shares this particular approach to the question of what is philosophy, where he looks at how philosophy is actually practiced in the neoliberal university today. So I and David are very excited to talk to him. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
All right, so we'll start with a very seemingly basic question, but as David pointed out, people throw around the word neoliberalism constantly. So if you could just say very briefly what exactly you mean by neoliberalism and the neoliberal university more broadly.
Sure. So, to the point that you've both made, people often view the use of the word neoliberalism as something that is sort of unique to left-wing critics, so it's often understood, or people present it as though it's merely pejorative. It is important to say, though, that it's a term that initially was adopted by the individuals who are behind it sort of theoretically. So it's not just something applied to them by critics, but something that they initially adopted for themselves. Now, in terms of what it is, I think we can look at it from a number of different angles. Most especially, and the thing that people probably most easily identify it as, is a paradigm within economics. So a way of doing economic theory. I wouldn't necessarily associate it with any specific doctrine, but there would be some that are pretty central to neoliberalism. So that's the first case, a paradigm of economic thought that exists. Secondly, you could view it, and I think it's rightly viewed, as a transnational social movement in the sense that the people who crafted this paradigm of economic thought then work to insinuate themselves into policymaking and to change the way that governance works globally, as well as, state by state, government by government, the local level, all the way to the global level. So there's a transnational social movement, and it was that from the very beginning, it should be mentioned. So it sort of begins with the first meeting of the Mont Pelerin Society. So at that point, what you're talking about is a group of people from really around the world convening, and there the idea is a kind of mid-century reaction against both socialism and fascism. The belief that the state and state overreach is the real enemy. And so therefore a revival, thus the name, the term neoliberalism, a revival of a kind of liberalism in contrast to socialism and fascism. Coming out more recently and sort of understanding the ways that this transnational social movement was sort of very successful in transforming the way that the world works at every level, really. You can look to someone like the Marxist geographer David Harvey, where the understanding of neoliberalism in practice, actually existing neoliberalism, if we want to use this sort of ironic term, is about retrenchment of class power and then the rollback subsequent rollback of the welfare state. So the idea that the state should shrink back from its previous over encroachment into life. And then again, an understanding that what that means then is that people at the bottom of society are increasingly left out and increasingly don't have guaranteed benefits of one kind or another from the government. We see this in his sort of historical recounting, it goes all the way back to Thatcher and Reagan. And then there's a kind of Foucauldian lens through which this is seen as well, sort of made, I think, I personally refer to Wendy Brown more often than I do to Foucault, probably. But Wendy Brown adopts this approach, and I think it's very useful in viewing neoliberalism then as an art of government, a way not only of using state power, but of thinking about power more generally and deploying it. And there, the key idea then would be the way that economic rationality is insinuated into every aspect of life. You mentioned, for example, the marketization of the university. So the way that economic rationality comes to govern, let's say, knowledge production. So that is then what we're talking about, again, as neoliberalism. So it's all of those things. It's a multidimensional phenomenon. And I think we have to keep them all in mind as we're talking about it. And then one of the things I really like to emphasize, and I think it's important to emphasize, is it's not as though there is something called like the essence of neoliberalism that is instantiated and repeated everywhere all at once in the same way. That's not how the world actually works. So when we're thinking about neoliberalism in practice, we're talking about then a dynamic phenomenon that exists and is transformed in its local context as it deals with different histories. So what neoliberalism looks like in India, or neoliberalization of the university looks like in India, is different than what it looks like in the United States, and they can't be the same thing, even though it's related to many of the same ideas and individuals in terms of, again, that transnational social movement.
Mm-hmm.
Go ahead, David. Sorry.
Oh. No, I was going to say, I appreciate that you're pointing out that it's not a monolith and that there are different ways in which it adapts to local circumstances, yet we can identify certain patterns or trends that characterize certain forms of government or certain economic tendencies as pushing us in a neoliberal direction, including the marketization of things, the commodification, as well as you mentioned the rolling back of collective protections in the case of government, like the welfare state. And I want to ask a question about how all of this is related to higher education, because your book is about neoliberalism and higher education. And nowadays we talk about the neoliberal university, which is this new figure / monster of the contemporary period that lets market values guide educational missions. And in particular, because you are trained as a philosopher like Rebecca and I, you zoom in on academic philosophy to try to help us understand whether philosophy is a resistance to neoliberalism, whether it is an expression of it. We often like to think of philosophers as these rebellious counter cultural agents who are ready to take down the man, like Socrates in the Agora. But in fact, things are a lot more complicated when we think about the fact that modern professional philosophers like us are situated within this neoliberal institution. And so my question to you is, how do we link this to higher ed first, and then more specifically to philosophy? So thinking in terms of concentric circles here.
Yeah, so when we talk about neoliberalism in the university, I tend to think of it through the lens of 4 different trends that are intersecting, but that all come together as part of neoliberalization. So those 4 trends, the first and the biggest is defunding and privatization. So this goes with the rollback of the welfare state. In the United States, for an example, if you go back into the 1970s with the invention of the concept of a student loan, what's happening there? Well, the state is basically saying we're not going to pay the institution directly and fund education by funding it directly to the institution. Instead, what we're going to do is responsibilize the individual student so that they now carry a debt, and they are going to sort of enter into a marketplace for education, right? So now then education is treated as a private commodity. So they use this loan money to choose on a marketplace which university they will go to. So you see that as a process of marketization. Then it's also related in that time period to tax revolt, the idea that state after state in the United States said essentially we're going to limit our own ability to tax citizens, and this is commensurate with the rise of neoliberalism. So defunding and privatization is one side. Related to that is the idea that education is job training. So a transition away from some sort of more capacious understanding, even as an ideal, I should say. So a person might rightly say, and many people did, that the university at mid-century presents itself as a certain kind of education, but in fact is job training, or is in some sense connected to, let's say, the military industrial complex. And that's all true, right? So, but we should say, even as an ideal, that ideal of education disappears, right? And you can connect this in our present day to the crisis faced by, for example, liberal arts colleges all across the country. All right, so change in the way we think about what education is then attends this marketization, this transformation and privatization, where we move from funding the institution directly to rolling it back and funding it through student loans. Connected to that is an instrumentalizing and commodification of knowledge, right? So knowledge is now understood in terms of what it can do or what it can produce. It's not necessarily a good in itself. That's not the purpose of it. That's not what it is about. Rather, one gets knowledge in order to do something else. One seeks knowledge for some other good. And in particular, one seeks knowledge as a commodity. I'm not really led to this point in the exposition, but there's a concept of human capital that is sort of central to neoliberal economic thought and to the practice of neoliberalism. And so already this idea of commodification of knowledge, privatization of education is oriented towards self-investment. So I buy this commodity, which is knowledge, but I'm doing it for some future ultimate payout, right? So that commodity is an investment commodity, something like a stock almost. And then finally, you have the centralization and bureaucratization of administration. Some people think about this in terms of the kind of collegial governance that once, at least mythically, dominated the academy has been transformed into a form of professionalized bureaucratic governance. So, more or less across the United States, institution by institution, there are alarm bells ringing about, for example, shared governance. At my own institution, and I'm sure yours and every other one, faculty are saying essentially our ability to control curriculum, our ability to weigh in on matters of importance, and have our voice be taken seriously as a power on campus, all of that has been diminished, and as we become more and more to look like a corporation or capitalist enterprise. So that's sort of how I view what I'm talking about under the heading of neoliberalization. I want to say this because I think it's important. I'm not a person who kind of looks back wistfully at a utopia that once existed and says, make the university great again. The university at mid-century, which is the thing that most people are nostalgic for, as I've already mentioned, was heavily integrated and continues to be obviously into the military-industrial complex. Herbert Marcuse, the philosopher, talks about a marriage of the welfare state and the warfare state, and the university is, I think, kind of key to that marriage at that point. And so even what we look back on as sort of the ideal period of higher education in the United States was already, from my point of view, a really problematic time period. And, as we were maybe going to talk a little bit about diversity or multiculturalism, it's important to remember that space that people are nostalgic for was almost exclusively white space. that it was openly exclusionary and racist and sexist, that it didn't hide any of that. It wore it on its sleeve. So I think it's important to say, in critique of neoliberalism and the critique of the neoliberal academy, the goal isn't to say we got to go back to that other thing.
Yeah. No, that reminds me in the Communist Manifesto where Karl Marx talks about reactionary communists who are people who want to go back to the way things were before rather than seeking a new future collectively. And I think that's really important in connection to the university because many of us who are in the university wouldn't be there if we had rolled this back to the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, not to mention also the collaboration of so many universities during the 50s, right, with McCarthyism
Sure.
and the like. And so I really appreciate that because often there is that risk of thinking that a critique of the present is always a call for a return to an idealized or a crystallized past. And we'll talk a little bit more about down the road on this interview about maybe what the future should look like. But I just wanted to say that this is, for me, a really essential clarification.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Go ahead.
Oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Rebecca.
Yeah, so, all right, beautiful. You've situated the neoliberal university in its historical context. You made it extremely clear, and rightfully so, that the point is not to go back behind neoliberalism. Can you talk to us a little bit about neoliberalism and philosophy specifically, right? Not just higher ed, but in what way is philosophy situated within this paradigm, or where do you see its effects in either or both, like students, recruiting students to pursue philosophy as a form of, a good investment in their degree, or how philosophers think of themselves? I take it in any direction you like.
Yeah, well, so I would start with my understanding of the situation of philosophy historically, has to do with, I think, I'm openly happy to proclaim myself not a follower per se, but a person who thinks that Lyotard got a couple things right. And this is one. I think the collapse of meta-narratives is a real phenomenon that is part of our society. I think you can see it in really mundane ways. So if I go to a faculty meeting and we're sort of all sitting in a circle and we're deciding somebody's going to get research funding, no one is going to defer to philosophy as like deciding who gets a say on what and what is legitimate and isn't, right? So we exist in a world where, from a kind of epistemological point of view, there is no hierarchy of knowledge such that philosophy would be on top, right? So philosophy is situated among the other disciplines as a co-equal, or hopefully one hopes at best. And so that does change the situation in a way, in terms of even what we're promising or what we can say or what we would say. And part of the way that changes is the justification for our existence. So why are you here, right? Why do we teach philosophy in universities? In a period where you could refer back to a meta-narrative and say, well, this is about the liberation of humanity, right? Like we all believe in some collective subject that is the human being or the human spirit. Okay, well, you have kind of an intrinsic justification for what you're doing. You're part of this broader liberatory project. But that's not something that people, sort of broadly speaking, buy into. And that kind of justification doesn't work publicly for our existence. And so we're put in a strange position where we have to now speak to the public to say, this is what we do, why we're important, why we're useful, why we should be part of a university education. And remember, we're doing that in a context where knowledge is a commodity, where it's instrumentalized. So to say to the other person, you should seek this because it's good in itself. You should want to come to my philosophy class and be part of it because this is going to be enlightening for you. That's not a justification that's going to work, or a way of talking that's going to be persuasive. So what then are we doing? Well, I think we're marketing philosophy. We're put in a position to market philosophy as providing that kind of human capital that I mentioned previously. That is to say, we offer something to you that you can invest in that will later on pay off. And it's going to pay off most especially in terms of job prospects and productivity. So part of that narrative has to do with an understanding of the knowledge economy, the idea that in our so-called 21st century economy, certain kinds of skills are more valuable than others. You see this also in relation to the debate around AI, for example. So people are saying, well, if AI is going to be as dominant as we think, right, then what's left of education? Like what could it provide? And one of the things that people are mentioning is what philosophers have in the last several decades said we do, which is critical thinking. So we say we teach you to think critically. That is an investment in your human capital that will pay off later, and it will pay off later in particular because of the transformations that we've seen in our economy, such as technological disruption. So that's the general narrative, I think, that's being put forward to people who might come to study philosophy. And that marketing of philosophy, I think, has an impact on the way that we teach philosophy and what the philosophy curriculum looks like. And again, this is not me, again, just to be clear, this is not me longing for a past where philosophy was done the right way. It is me saying that I think that if we pay attention to what's happened, the dynamic, the historical dynamic over time, we're seeing changes in the way that philosophy is taught, changes in the nature of the philosophy curriculum, and changes in what it is we claim to be doing when we teach philosophy. And those changes center around this concept of critical thinking, but also other skills. For an example, I have general education learning outcomes that are tagged to my introductory ethics class, one of which is cultural competence in a global society. So we can come back to this when we have maybe a larger discussion of the question of diversity. But here again, you see then, okay, this time it's not exactly critical thinking, but I am offering you a form of human capital in this understanding of cultural competence. So again, the way we understand and teach philosophy will be shaped by this.
Yeah, and I think this is something that certainly applies to philosophy, but applies more broadly than just philosophy. It's a problem that the humanities as a whole are facing, that the rationale that we have for a long time used to defend the autonomy of the humanities from the natural sciences are weirdly gaining this new traction and this new currency in the age of AI that is threatened to automate things that are more common in the sciences, potentially. And it's something that I face personally when advising students a lot. When they ask me, why should I study humanities? Why should I study philosophy? I feel like maybe 10 years ago, the answer was things like, oh, because it will allow you to get a better score on the LSAT or on the MCAT, and there is research for that philosophy majors do better on these exams. So always this tit for tat, this negotiation back and forth with students about what's in it for them down the road if they invest in themselves through philosophy. Now, interestingly, it's kind of the creative, spiritualized dimension of the discipline that has taken on that role in the age of artificial intelligence and large language models. But your comment about diversity makes me want to ask that question now, because one of the things that has happened with the rise of the neoliberal university is also the spread of what in your book you referred to as neoliberal multiculturalism. And it refers to the spread of all these initiatives on campuses across the United States, North America, and other places that are designed to bring diversity into a more central position within the university. So think about DEI initiatives, diversity. Oh my God, I always forget the acronym: diversity, excellence, and inclusion. Is that DEI? Equity. Okay, it's a good E word. I knew that. Diversity, equity, and inclusion. Think about offices on campus for inclusion. Pamphlets showing people with different racial backgrounds smiling about how great the university is. And of course, we know that in the present, many of those initiatives are under threat. We know that with DEI. We know that with the scare tactics around critical race theory and the way they're made to play a particular function in our political climate under the Trump administration. And so while we might want to defend them from those attacks, I think it's also really important to take a very sober look at the function, the structural function that those initiatives play within the landscape of the neoliberal university. And your book does a really good job at walking us through that. So, can you talk to us a little bit about the role that the language of multiculturalism has come to play in higher education in the last few decades, and how it might actually be, in some ways, contributing to the pervasive whiteness and Eurocentrism of the university itself?
Yeah, so I mean, thank you for introducing that in the way you did, and I think it to some ways, and for many people, I'm sure it's paradoxical, right? It's a sort of odd idea that that initiatives related to diversity, equity, and inclusion, for example, or multiculturalism, would then somehow not be about producing diversity, but instead maybe even the opposite. And now, again, to be clear, this is in no way to support, and I can sort of at least provide a little bit of my thoughts about what the attacks on DEI are really about as well. But so I don't support those attacks, obviously, or maybe it's not obvious, so I'm stating it for a fact that I don't support those attacks. But but let's think about sort of what this idea of neoliberal multiculturalism is and how it functions. And I should say this goes to it's not really my term; it belongs to Jody Melliman. So but the idea of neoliberal multiculturalism is a way, I think, that power has negotiated with certain demands placed on the university. And this really goes, I mean, diversity initiatives more broadly go all the way back to the late 60s and early 70s and the student activism of that time, where the demand was for a real significant revision of the curriculum, and one that would decisively break Eurocentric understanding of the world. So, that's where the student activists were, that's where the push was coming from. And then, so what happens? How does all this transform? Well, in the mid-century, we could say the United States settled on a self-conception, settled on an understanding of the Constitution, settled on a mythological narrative about what it is. And that narrative and understanding of the Constitution we associate with the civil rights movement and with the legislation and court decisions and Supreme Court decisions connected to that decision. And so there you have the rise of a kind of liberal multiculturalism or liberal anti-racism, right? And at that moment, the vision of the United States is one in which people will have sort of a fair shot, right? So that's kind of, if you like, what the liberal multicultural framework is moving ahead. So neoliberal multiculturalism is going to adopt many of these sort of same patterns of thought, right? And in relationship to the same thing, to new demands from below and new pressures from above, institutions have to reshape themselves and respond to these questions. So how do they do it? Well, we're going to move away from the kinds of programs and ideas that were associated with that mid-century liberal multiculturalism and reconceive diversity, for example, as an individual trait that belongs to the person and as something that is investable. So that's going to be a sort of a key component here. Connected to it, you get the idea that the market can actually sort people in a meritocratic way. Okay, so what happens? Ultimately, I'm going to say the losers on the market are pathologized and racialized, right? So those who don't win in this battle are on the market, are the new sort of underclass, while some people, again, if they are able to valorize that diversity, use it to function as a form of capital, then are elevated. And so this process then produces an underclass that, let's be real, was the pre-existing underclass anyway, right? So it's not like it completely transforms the world. you can see it's easier to explain the process that I just sort of presented in the K through 12, and then sort of connect it to our own situation in higher education. So think about if we go back to the heady days of the early 2000s and the George W. Bush administration, there's an idea of no child left behind, right? And so what it created was a competition. So schools that do well get additional funding. Those that do poorly do badly. What's the language that is used? It's an anti-racist language. So what are they saying? They're saying these schools are failing students of color. They're failing other students, but again, primarily students of color. And we're going to make it better, right? We're going to ensure that everyone gets a good education. How are we going to do that? We're going to let the market decide. And on the basis of market incentives, schools will have a reason to perform better. Yeah, and we're going to judge this using these tests. So what really happens? What really happens through that process is that funding is redirected to the schools that were already doing very well to begin with, right? Funding is redirected, federal funding is redirected toward the very people who were in good shape and pulled out from, right? Pulled away from the schools that are predominantly schools that are dealing with educating people of color, children of color. So that same process then, I think, repeats at the higher education level. What we see is a reinvestment in the same people who were always at the top, in fact, stripping of investment at the same time and reallocating it toward the top from the people who are historically at the bottom. So what would look like, what might seem to be geared toward creating greater equality in society is in fact, as some sociologists put it, an engine of inequality. It generates greater social inequality. So this meritocratic belief that the university can serve as a vehicle for diversification of society, for social uplift, is actually sort of a smokescreen for a reality in which the university is primarily serving to re-entrench and obscure the social inequalities that already exist. So I hope that came across. I know that was a lengthy explanation, so apologies. And it's a complex story, but it's one I think that if we don't understand, we miss what's really happening a lot of the time. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'm very tempted to ask a follow-up, which is that how do you explain the vicious attacks from reactionaries against DEI? But David, you're the time master. Do you think we have time for that and our final question?
Yeah, we have time for a short follow-up. I will never say no to an interesting discussion about neoliberalism.
So
go for both.
So I would say, one of the things I would look to is J.D. Vance. In his book, Hillbilly Elegy, he makes this really weird and interesting comment about why he says, hillbillies resent Barack Obama. And it's because he thinks he's better than us. Now, I don't think that J.D. Vance is actually right about this. I think there's a great deal of sort of racism that just is there anyway. And so like why people reacted the way they did to Barack Obama's presidency is, I think, broadly very easy to understand as simply racism. I don't think it requires a much deeper explanation. But I think as we look at it, what we have to see is that there was a group of people who were already losing in the rollback and who had been guaranteed certain things by the mid-century economy, by the sort of American industrial powerhouse, right? So often this would be understood as the white working class, but it doesn't have to be. So the key point is a whole lot of people were invested emotionally in terms of their identity and also financially in a world that was going to keep moving forward, where they were going to do better and better, their children were going to do better and better. And the university plays a key role in that because it's part of the myth, right? It's part of the myth of the American dream, part of the idea that of social uplift, that you, if you work hard, can send your kids to the university, they'll get an education, they'll exit blue collar work into white collar work, and life will be better, right? And so I think what we see is a collapsing of that dream, and so and that myth, and I think what that generates is a great deal of animosity at the university, particularly because at the same time students are taking on extreme debt, right? So they're buried in debt. So a reaction against the university, a reaction therefore against intellectualism, a kind of elitism, and then, and this is, I know, kind of a lengthy process to connect it, but I would say two ideals of diversity that really do have their home in the university. So, of course, it's true that, like, if you go to a major corporation, Google or whatever, there are diversity statements and courses that you have to take on diversity or trainings. So I'm not disagreeing with that, but I think that the home of the concept, the place where it really has a institutional power, has been the university. So we were a place where it was sold as a form of human capital, but also the house where it really landed. And so I think when all of that comes crashing down as neoliberalism expands and it leaves more and more people out, it's inevitable that there's going to be, I think, a reaction against all of those things at the same time, against the people who are now cast as the elite intellectuals who support diversity. And then once that attaches to a pre-existing racism, of course, then you can, just basically purge black women from positions of power, for example, which has obviously occurred under the Trump administration. So I know that's, again, a complex explanation. I hope it makes sense, but I think it's a lot of different trends and phenomena that kind of come together, but they all actually do come to this neoliberal multiculturalism, I think, and the associated forms of anti-racism. Like, that's where the kernel of it really lies, from my point of view.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I think we could probably have an entire hour-long conversation about this by itself. And I don't want to force you to try to explain something so, like, as you say, multifaceted in a very short interview. So, yeah, I'm sure we'll continue to have these conversations, but I do want to bring us to perhaps a little ray of hope, perhaps. So in your work, you talk so much about, the ways in which, the manner in which we do philosophy, broadly speaking, not everyone, accepts the neoliberal paradigm as kind of coterminous with reality. It's a kind of, almost like a capitalist realism, and you allude to Mark Fisher in your book a lot. And you enumerate the ways that philosophers have internalized and reproduced the neoliberal, not to throw around this word, but ideology in their work, and that philosophy is, in its current practice, broadly and for the most part, actually neoliberal, if that's a fair characterization.
Yeah, I mean, I use the term neoliberal philosophy to speak of what I see as a current sort of paradigm of thought and practice within the discipline, at least as it is understood in professional space. So what does that really amount to? I think it means that we, as the people working in these institutions, internalize the values of the institutions. I think even people who are pretty critical, me, you, whoever, like people who are relatively conscious of the fact, nonetheless, we face these imperatives on a day-to-day basis. And that results in that we come to think in those terms, right? So to kind of understand this, I think the easiest thing to think about is, for example, ratings and ranking systems. So you think about impact factors, but in the case of professional philosophy, probably the most well-known would be the Leiter report rankings. So we understand what constitutes good philosophy through these sort of quantitative metrics and rating systems and ranking systems, whether that's, again, number of publications, impact factors, rankings on the Leiter report, and so forth. Those things come to justify our actions as philosophers. in terms of what we seek to understand, to know, to do, ultimately what things we publish. For an example, many of us engage in what we might call grant-seeking behavior. So,
Symptomatic of a deep pathology.
yeah, and so that way of thinking, I think, results in the end, a kind of one-dimensional form of philosophy where the what you've seen me do, I think, repeatedly over the course of this time is fail to offer simple explanation for something. So what is neoliberalism? And I'm like, well, there are four trends, and it's multidimensional and dynamic, and it happens. And I think that's how reality is, and how thinking must be, right? So if we're thinking about ourselves and we're looking at our institutions and we're looking how we as philosophers, as professional philosophers, interact with those institutions, we have to have a multidimensional understanding of what's occurring. And I think you all in your book have been doing that. I'm trying to do that. And that multidimensional understanding, unfortunately, is often lacking, I would say, among those who work alongside us in the institution. Very often, the internalized norms of the institution are treated as if they were somehow natural, or as if they were in themselves justified, required no further explanation or discussion. I mean, I think you can see this. I mentioned grant-seeking behavior. Foucault famously talks about neoliberalism in terms of an entrepreneurship of oneself. And this goes back to the idea of human capital and self-investment. In my own book, I talk about performance of performativity. So by performance of performativity, I mean the public demonstration that you are investable, right? So I have to make a promise of return on investment. And I do that by, in some way, demonstrating productivity. That if you invest now, you'll get something later. So grant-seeking behavior works in much that way. That's a form of entrepreneurship of self in which you perform your performativity in order to become investable. All of that, then, I think, comes to shape the way we think about what is good philosophy, what it means to do good philosophy. For an example, I'm sure a lot of people who, if they ever found their way accidentally to engaging my book or even hearing its title, would just think that isn't philosophy, right? So what you're doing just isn't philosophy. Maybe it's sociology or social theory, maybe, but it certainly isn't philosophy. And that way of thinking, I think, is oriented again to our kind of one-dimensionality, and it forces that one-dimensionality. So in my book, I talk about discipline policing, and they're drawing on work that you all have done, as well as Christy Dotson and others, to talk about the ways that we police the boundaries of what counts as philosophy, and doing that ensures a kind of one-dimensionality, that we don't hear voices outside of the ones that we've already predetermined count. And so how do we judge who counts, what voices we're supposed to listen to? I think that's going to be based on very often, and I don't mean this to be critical of every single person. Many people don't think this way, but again, it's going to be based on questions about how do I get grants. They're very strategic questions. How do I get published? I have to get published in order to get tenure, so how am I going to do that? Where do I publish, and who do I have to cite or know in order to get published there? So each of those questions becomes very significant in the life of the professional philosopher, shaping, what we research, what we say, what we do, what we want, what we think that we're up to as philosophers.
Yeah, in our book, we talk about this as strategizing, as academic strategizing that is cultivated by the neoliberal university, and that leads us to see the pursuit of knowledge as a series of strategic moves in a game of chess, where the goal is to take the queen, whatever that means.
Right. Yeah.
We're constantly on the move and constantly seeking to advance, to beef up our CV, and to the extent that that is an entrepreneurial attitude toward our professional selves, it highlights the extent to which neoliberalism has not only taken over the university, but has taken over the minds of those of us who find ourselves as workers in the university. And I mean, because as we all know, time is money. We are coming here very close to the end of our interview. But I wanted to mention, Brandon, that one thing that your book and our book share in common is that we both end by hoping for a future philosophy, a philosophy that is more open, that is also more reflective about its own material conditions of actuality, and that can hold a mirror to itself without having to flinch away, either in disgust or in escapist self-delusion. It's hard to be concrete and practical about what that looks like. Sometimes it just comes out as a cry or a desire for something that is indefinite and to come. So we definitely relate to the sense of we're describing something that's complex and on the move, and we can't give you an easy solution because that's the world that we live in.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think as we think about that future and craft it, from my point of view, at least, and this is, I think, something that comes out in your work as well, it has to be a collective project because philosophy is already, whether or not we admit it, already a social endeavor and something we're doing collectively. So whatever it is, I hope for, or whatever my vision is, that's one thing. But what would be great, I think, in time is to build something new on the basis of a shared collective vision that we have to work out together. That is, as our own country demonstrates in spades, being together with others is never simple or easy. There's always going to have to be negotiation and communication. And to do that, we're going to have to learn to hear each other across difference and work through it. But right now, we're not, I would say, as collectively as a discipline, we're not even in the space to do that because we haven't thought through the real situation we're actually in to be able to build a collective vision together of what we want philosophy to be in contrast to what it is presently.
That is a beautiful answer. I am very glad that you drew attention to the collective nature of what any kind of solution must be. And I want to, we're very much out of time, but I wanted to encourage all of our viewers to go check out Brendan's work. It is invigorating. It is wonderful. It's very closely tied, or very much, I would say, of a piece with what David and I are trying to work on in the book as well. I mean, we may have finer points of differences here or there, but nevertheless, I think it's invaluable if you want to understand the way in which contemporary philosophy, as it is practiced, may not be what you think it is.